presentation that we're going to go through, and then we're going to open it back up again for conversation. And so that was the topic of addiction. So we've done depression, anxiety, dementia, and addiction. So addiction would be the fourth and final one in your handout if you're following along there, taking any notes with that. So we'll follow the same outline for this, the terms, symptoms, anything in the Bible that relates to it, and then some suggestions and a psalm. And then we'll open it back up for conversation, so be thinking if there's anything you want to voice or talk about. We can have an open time of doing that. So I've mentioned a few times this morning that there's a diagnostic manual that is considered the standard for making diagnoses in mental health. Sometimes you'll hear the term mental health, behavioral health, psychiatry. They all kind of are meant to emphasize a different angle and importance. But in that manual, there is this chart. And I don't know how well that'll show up from where you are, but there is a chart with a variety of what are recognized as substances or drugs, and then differing things that they can cause. And then you'll see an I, which stands for intoxication, and you'll see a W, which stands for withdrawal. And one of the things I really want to try to get out of this presentation is trying to develop a sense of empathy. I think sometimes the church can look at someone with some issue of addiction and maybe not be quite as empathetic. And so one of the things I want to try to do with this topic is to try to get us to think about empathy. And as I thought about doing that, if you can read that, you might notice that one of the recognized substances is caffeine. I'm not here to say that you should or shouldn't have caffeine. I usually have a lot of coffee in the morning, so I'm not going to say no caffeine. But what I do think is interesting is that there are we wouldn't go around and talk about caffeine intoxication. We wouldn't tend to do that, but clinically, you can be intoxicated with caffeine. You can feel kind of jittery, you can feel anxious in a way, you can, maybe you know that feeling. If you have had energy drinks or you drink a lot of coffee or soda, or you might know that feeling. And we wouldn't say I'm intoxicated, but from a clinical perspective, caffeine has some I's on the chart. Sometimes, if you don't have your caffeine that you are used to having on a regular basis, you might get a headache, or you might get some other symptoms. From a clinical perspective, you could talk about having caffeine withdrawal symptoms. That is your body having adjusted to a substance, and now you don't have the substance, and your body is doing something to respond to that. And I start that this way because I think that, I don't know about all of us, probably many of us, I want to say this very carefully and not be misunderstood, but many of us have probably been intoxicated by caffeine and have had a caffeine withdrawal. And if we think in those symptoms, I hope it becomes a bit more easy to empathize. Now, are there things that are far more dangerous and have far more effects to society and to homes and to people than caffeine, than coffee? Yes, absolutely. And even this chart, if we were to go through it real carefully, makes those distinctions. But I just want to try to step back and think big picture and realize that there's a lot more reliance on things than what we might sometimes think. Some things we come down really hard on, and then something else we don't make any issue of at all, due to sometimes, yes, the amount of impact on society it has, but also just certain stigmas and what's normal in a society and a host of different things. The manual goes on And it includes these things. It says, in addition to the substance-related disorders, this chapter also includes gambling disorder, reflecting evidence that gambling behaviors activate reward systems similar to those activated by drugs of abuse and produce some behavioral symptoms that appear comparable to those produced by the substance use disorders. Other excessive behavioral patterns, such as internet gaming, have also been described, but the research on these and other behavioral syndromes is less clear. Thus, groups of repetitive behaviors, which some term behavioral addictions, with such subcategories as sex addiction, exercise addiction, or shopping addiction, are not included because at this time there is insufficient peer-reviewed evidence to establish the diagnostic criteria and course descriptions needed to identify these behaviors as mental disorders. So they're saying at this moment in time, and this is updated every few years, at this time, these are not things a person would be diagnosed with, but it's not to say that down the road something could change. And then with a diagnosis, there's always suggestions of a like plan of treatment kind of thing. So will the day come that a person can go to the hospital and have a shopping addiction diagnosis, or exercise addiction, sex addiction, internet gaming? We're kind of in that in-between time period. So how is it that addictions develop? And I wanted to give a sort of illustration that I hope is somewhat lighthearted, but at the same time illustrates the process. So if I am near a Dairy Queen, and if I've had a rough day, I'm not feeling too great, and I'm near a Dairy Queen, it is very likely that I might go and get a Blizzard. Probably just a mini Blizzard, and it would be chocolate chip cookie dough, because that's the best Blizzard. But let's say that I go and I get my chocolate chip cookie dough mini Blizzard, and the next day, and because of the sugar and all the feel-good things in ice cream, I feel better at the end of the day. I've had my Blizzard. Let's say the next day, I've had another rough day, and I feel like I need a little more. So now I get the small. The mini isn't going to do it today. It did it for me yesterday, but now I get the small. And let's say that now every other day I get a small Blizzard. And soon enough that turns into every day I get the small Blizzard. And then now the everyday small Blizzard isn't doing it, so I go to the medium. And then I go, and soon enough I'm having a large cookie dough Blizzard every day to get through the day. Soon enough one isn't enough, so then I have one at lunch and one at dinner. And before you know it, my whole world is revolving around ice cream and around getting that little dopamine release of the Blizzard. And we laugh and we chuckle at that. And while I know that is a lighthearted sort of scenario, there are people who it's a very real scenario. And in the church, we may not come down too hard on that, but it's a very real scenario, a very real addiction. Because what has happened is through stress and difficult times, you get depressed, like we talked about this morning. You get a little pick-me-up, and then you get into that cycle. You go back down, you got to get the thing that picks you up. What at one time didn't pick you up, or picked you up, now you need more of it. And then you need more of it. And then you need more of it. And that is how addiction develops. Something has happened, the person tries to pick themselves up oftentimes, and with time, they adapt. More and more and more and more and more is needed to get the same feel-good response. What does the Bible say about addiction? In the letters to Timothy and Titus, in some translations you will find the word addiction or addicted, as it pertains to elders and deacons. 1 Timothy 3:3 and Titus 1:7, speaking of elders, in a few translations will have the phrase, not addicted to wine. The Greek word that's used there has to do with the idea of staying near something, staying near wine in this instance. And while this morning we looked at some verses talking about the word anxious, and I said I'm not sure that that in our modern day context is necessarily the best translation, I do, however, from what I've understood, think that this probably does align more with our understanding of what addiction is. Ancient people may not have spoken about cortisol levels and a dopamine release and all these sort of things, but this idea of needing something and keeping it close to you does seem similar from what I've understood. Also, just something to be aware of is that there's multiple New American Standard translations, which I just on kind of an aside, I think is sort of humorous because they put out the new, and it was going to be the American Standard. And then every few years, the new American Standard Bible is updated. So in 77 and 95, this is the wording that you find there. Pertaining to deacons in the ESV and then the New American Standards of 77 and 95 translates something along the lines of not, and then the phrase is addicted to much wine. It is actually a different word in Greek than what the one is with elders, which I think is interesting. But it's a similar sort of concept of something always giving your attention to it. So, again, I do think there's some similarity here with the concept of what we're talking about. Another word or words that, while it might not be a clinical definition of addiction, but seems to be conveying a similar thing in ancient thought, are the words drunkard and glutton in the Old Testament. So Proverbs 23 and verse 21 says, "For the drunkard and the glutton will become poor, and grogginess will clothe them in rags." And if you look at the word drunkard and where that comes from and what it means and is talking about, it's a Hebrew word used to refer to dyeing a fabric. And it's the idea of being completely immersed and soaked in something. So again, maybe they wouldn't have used the same sort of clinical language as us, but I do think the concept exists and can be found in certain texts. An interesting thing about the word glutton, so if drunkard refers to dyeing fabric and something being completely saturated, the word translated as glutton is a Hebrew word used to refer to a lack of self-discipline and responsible use of resources. And then when we translate it over to English, glutton is related to gullet, which is an old word used to refer to the space from the mouth to the stomach. And then our word for gulp also comes from that. So again, as we try to think about empathetically engaging with these sort of things, there might be certain things that we would tend to come down really hard on, but how many of us might have in our country here today, with all that is readily available, how many of us might have a lack of self-discipline? How many of us do not responsibly use resources? How many of us are putting things in our gullet? We're going and get the big gulp, which is where all of that comes from. Gulp and gullet in terms of history of words, and then glutton, it's all very related. So I would just encourage us to all kind of take a step back and think, in what ways am I maybe a glutton, but because it's become very socially acceptable in our day and time to live as a glutton, we don't really think anything about it. Well, are there any biblical examples then of addiction? Some, when looking at this issue, have looked to the life of Solomon, and wondered if we could highlight something in Solomon, I feel like I'm saying that in a weird way, Solomon's life. If you just step back and look at all that Solomon has, is the text intended to make us think, look at how much God has blessed Solomon? Or are we supposed to step back and say, at what point has this gotten a bit gluttonous in Solomon's life? It says that his provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. For he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tipsha to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates, and he had peace on all sides around him. And Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan even to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots, and 12,000 horsemen. And then it goes on in another chapter. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, "You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you. For surely they will turn away your heart after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. So when we read through these things, are we as readers of this trying to follow the storyline of the Bible and Israel and Judah and how God is working through the kings? Are we supposed to, as readers, look at that and say, look how much God has blessed Solomon? Or are we supposed to look at it and say, at what point is this not very responsible? Was Solomon in his own time an addict, not using things responsibly? So some in discussions of the Bible and addiction have pointed to Solomon as a possible example. In the New Testament, the character sometimes referred to as the rich man who Jesus speaks to, he told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. So there's plenty. And he thought to himself, what shall I do, for I have nowhere to store my crops? And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. When we look at that phrase, build larger ones, is there something there that we could pick up on in this conversation? It had produced plentifully, meaning there's plenty, but he needs a little bit more, and a little more, and a little more. And is the text here highlighting something of that we could take in this conversation? So what are some practical suggestions? I think first, to be empathetic through self-examination, like I've been trying to say. At the hospital where I work as a chaplain, we have our detox unit, and I think it can be easy for people, myself included, to look at that unit and kind of think, I'm not there. But how many of us, if we are honest with ourselves, how many of us have, maybe it's not alcohol or drugs, but how many of us have something that we go to when we're down to pick us up? And then we go back to it again. And then we go back to it again. Maybe it's something that there is no hospitalization for. Like one of the slides we looked at, there's no diagnosis and inpatient treatment for shopping addiction. But is that a very real thing with a lot of people? Very much so. Thinking about Matthew 7, 3 through 5, and why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Addiction to social media, to technology. How often do we have to check the phone? Sexual addictions, gaming addictions, like that excerpt had said. How many things are there that are out there that we don't think about in the same terms, but are as real as these other things? A second suggestion, listen to the low before condemning the high. I think sometimes we're very quick to condemn the activity that the person has turned to without doing the hard work of understanding why is it that they have turned to that thing. If a person is trying to pick themselves up and get a high from something, that means that there was something in their life that had resulted in them feeling very low. And so what was that? Just like when we were talking about depression and anxiety and trying to move into the past to understand and listen before we try to push someone into the future, similarly here, we might sometimes look at behaviors and say, well, that's wrong, don't do that, that's bad. We condemn the high, but we never step into their story to try to understand the low. When in life did they start to turn to that, and what was going on? And how do we empathetically engage that story? Because until you empathetically engage the cause of the low, condemning the high is not going to do anything. Because it's still going to be there until that low is worked through. And I think sometimes we're quick to jump and condemn the high. We never take the time to understand what were they trying to raise themselves up from. Third suggestion, hold accountable and don't enable. I had a supervisor one time who said, behind every ongoing situation of addiction, there is usually a circle of people somewhere enabling that behavior. And it took me a while to really understand what was being talked about there. But I do believe that that's very true. There is someone somewhere in some circle feeding that. And again, until we understand that, it's also going to be hard to correct that. And so don't be part of that circle feeding that and enabling that. Romans 1 and verse 32 talks about things, and then it says it's also wrong, those who would approve of those who practice them. A fourth helpful thing is to become familiar with support groups. I've heard a lot of people talk about the help that something like AA has been, 12-step programs have been. And I've heard many stories of people who have talked about how helpful those things were, and what happened is once they got doing better, they stopped attending the meetings. And once they stopped attending the meetings, they went back to whatever it was. And so to become familiar with those groups in an area, to be able to recommend, to refer, and then to encourage ongoing involvement with that can be really helpful. And then lastly, just being people of hospitality, being a church of hospitality. If you look at the word hospitality, it has the word hospital in the room. This is a hospital. I've been talking a lot this morning about the hospital that I work at. This also is a hospital. It's not a medical hospital. It's not a psychiatry hospital, but this nonetheless is a hospital. This is a place of healing. This is a place of welcome and of hospitality. And it should all make us do some self-reflection and examination and ask ourselves, would people struggling with addiction feel comfortable being here? Would it feel hospitable? Or would it feel like they don't belong? I think there's a lot of congregations, unfortunately, where it would not feel hospitable. They would not be made to feel as though they belong. They would be made to feel as though they are of another class. And what the church is meant to be is a place of hospitality. Yes, spiritually, but then our spiritual lives go into everything else. It's a holistic view of things. This is a spiritual hospital, but that's going to impact, it should, someone struggling with something like addiction. Then I leave us today with Mark 2 and verse 17 as far as the last part of this slide. Jesus says, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." I think that's a very helpful verse for us to think about. So to close with our last psalm of the day, in reading people's things about talking about their struggles with addiction and such, Psalm 30 seems like a psalm that is frequently referenced, specifically verses 1 and 2 and 11 and 12. There seems like there's something about this psalm that resonates with and that gives hope to people in those situations. Psalm 30, verses 1 and 2. "I will extol you, O Lord, for you have lifted me up and have not let my foes rejoice over me. O Lord my God, I cried out to you, and you healed me." And then verse 11, "You have turned for me my mourning into dancing. You have put off my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness, to the end that my glory may sing praise to you and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever."